This lecture will cover information from Chapter 2, which is basically on research methods in social psychology. This first slide covers the steps to conducting research. Step 1, form a question. So a researcher finds an area of interest for them. Step 2, search the literature. So conducting a literature review. Now, once a researcher finds a topic that they're curious about or interested in, then they need to take a look at what other researchers have examined. What other studies have they designed and implemented? So how we conduct a search on a literature review, basically what we want to do is take a look at online databases. Now, if you've ever heard of EBSCOhost or ProQuest or PsycInfo, you might think that these are actually websites, but they're not. These are online databases. For instance, our college actually has access to EBSCOhost. If you bring your SCC ID, you can go to UCI and have privileges to use their library there, and you'll be able to also access PsycInfo and ProQuest. These online databases give you access to what we call scholarly articles, and these scholarly articles are written by researchers in the field in order for others in the field to gain more information about a particular topic. Or maybe they're writing these articles for other people who are interested in this area as well. So when we're looking at scholarly articles, these are articles that are based on empirical data conducted through official research. Step 3, form a hypothesis. So based on what other researchers have found in the past, I'll formulate what I might anticipate I'll find in my current study. Step 4, create an operational definition. So say for instance I want to take a look at violent behavior in children. So I want to give it a clear operational definition of what I mean by violence. What are certain criteria that would show me violence? What are specific behaviors that would embody violence as a measurement? It's really important that we actually create a very clear, concise, specific operational definition. For instance, if I were to just ask a question, do drugs lower academic performance in high school students? You might think, well, it depends on the drug, and if you're thinking that, you're absolutely right. So that when we're looking at drug use, it probably is too loose of an operational definition to utilize in a research study, because then there's too many different kinds of effects that various types of drugs will have. So what would be a better operational definition would be, say, specifically choosing a particular category of drugs like stimulants, or even a specific drug like methamphetamine. The more we can come up with a very tight, clean operational definition, the more this will allow us to get specifically at the kind of data and results that we're looking for. The looser that operational definition is, the more we open the study up to what we call confounding variables. And these are aspects that affect the research results, but that the researcher did not include or consider. And we want to make sure, especially with cause and effect research, in other words, experiments, we really want to make sure that we minimize the level of confounding variables so that the data is really reflecting what it is we're trying to research. Step 5 is collect and analyze data. So if it's quantitative research, we would acquire data through the form of numbers. When we take a look at this data, we want to analyze it. And quantitative data is typically what we think of when we're looking at research studies. And this is where we would want to not only look at raw data and do some simple analyses like taking the range, mode, and mean and taking a look at that. Mean would just be your average across all the responses or data from each respondent. Then we would look at mode, which is basically the most frequent response for a particular question. And then the range would be like, what's the lowest to the highest response given for a particular question. So that's simple data collection. But then we also want to take that data and go through more specific, more in-depth statistical analysis. So we take that raw data and input it into some kind of software. What we typically use in psychology and other areas of research outside of psychology will use the same software oftentimes. And this is a program called SPSS. We punch in our raw data, input it there, and then we can tell it to run certain kinds of statistical analyses so that we can determine whether or not our data on a statistical level is really showing us a significant result. And then step 6, we propose or revise a theory. So once we've obtained some information that's meaningful from our data, then we see, does it have any implications on current theories that might warrant some kind of revision? Or maybe we're discovering something absolutely new, so we come up with a new concept or new theory. And then as we want to refine that research or ask more questions or delve into that topic even further, we will go ahead and follow these steps all over again. So what's a correlation? What do they show us? Keep in mind that correlations show us a relationship between two or more variables. Correlational studies are not equipped to actually identify cause and effect. While a correlational study might reveal an actual cause and effect, it's not actually designed to identify that. So again, correlations show you a relationship between two or more variables. So some types of correlational studies include observational or naturalistic methods, and this is where social psychologists would actually do things like looking at archival research, meaning they look at recorded data that's been used for a different purpose like census or just recording crime rates in a neighborhood or looking at temperature trends when we're looking at the weather. And so social psychologists would look at things like, what happens to crime rates as we enter the hotter times of the year? And one well-known correlation that social psychologists have found over and over again is that as temperatures increase in our weather, crime rates also increase at the same time. This would be a correlation. This is not showing you cause and effect. It's just merely telling you that these two things are happening at the same time. But we have to be careful with how people present correlational information. For instance, not too long ago when Mayor Villaraigosa was the mayor of Los Angeles still, I remember listening on the radio that he and the sheriff of Los Angeles, they were going to have a press conference later that day because they wanted to talk about how they've increased presence of law enforcement officers on the streets, and at the same time, crime rates have decreased. Now, what they're trying to have you here is that having a greater number of law enforcement officers on the streets has actually caused a decrease in crime rates. But that's actually not what's happening. They're just recording crime rates, looking at the trends, looking at hiring trends as well. And then they're saying, hey, we see these two things happening at the same time. So we have to be careful with the information that gets presented to us because oftentimes the people presenting that information want us to hear cause and effect when in fact what they're showing us or telling us or sharing with us is actually correlational information. Additional observational methods would be social psychologist researchers going into naturalistic settings and observing behavior. So it could be things like play behavior between children or adults negotiating conflict between each other and just watching them in a natural setting where that's occurring, not creating any changes or putting people into different groups or what have you. Another thing that social psychologists oftentimes do that also is related to correlational studies is a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is basically doing a literature review. And what those researchers are doing is analyzing data from various studies that have previously been conducted. And they're trying to see if there might be any interconnections or any relation between the data of various previously completed studies. So again, these kinds of designs are not there to show cause and effect. They're just there to show you a relationship between two or more variables. Also, self-reports or survey methods will result in correlational studies. So for instance, if you've ever filled out a survey asking you about what you thought of a class or a teacher, or what you've thought of a certain product, or how you feel about your car a year later after you've purchased it, these would all be survey or self-report methods. And again, a researcher is not dividing people up into separate groups as you would with an experiment. The data that they're collecting from you is really going to show them trends or connections. For instance, they might say, oh, women who bought a Honda Civic in the last year were happier with their purchase than were men, or what have you. So this is just showing, again, correlational data that you might derive from a survey method. The other thing that we have to keep in mind with regard to the difficulty of doing surveys or self-reports is making sure that we're getting accurate, usable data. So we talked about previously the shady beginnings of psychology. And one of those shady beginnings is also framing of words and using reference points. What I mean by that is, depending on how a researcher frames a question in a survey or interview, that can actually influence how the respondent or the subject will actually answer that question. Maybe the researcher intended the question to be understood a certain way. However, based on the other person's perspective and way of thinking, they've understood it differently. It's much like when you're taking an exam that a teacher's written and you're like, what are they asking in this question? It makes absolutely no sense to you. Well, my guess and my hope is that, like me, those instructors weren't trying to purposely give you a confusing question. Instead, what happens, I find, is that in my head, the question's very clear. But once it makes its way to my students, they're seeing it from a different perspective and with their own understanding and background and experience, and that's creating a different interpretation from their point of view. And so, survey methods, we have to be careful of wording of questions. Additionally, people might not really even care about their survey. Maybe they're just trying to answer the questions really quickly. And so, sometimes you're getting inaccurate data because people aren't being careful, or maybe they outright lie. Or maybe you're sending the survey to a bunch of people, but not enough people care about it, and so you don't get a very high response rate. So these are all challenges that you might have with a survey method. Here's an example of what a correlation might look like. So when we're looking at social status and health or self-esteem and academic achievement, we might say, and we do find this in social psychology, that the higher a person's social status is or socioeconomic status is, like class, the greater their health tends to be. That might make sense, possibly, because maybe as X creates Y, maybe having more access to money gives more access to greater healthcare or better quality healthcare, or the possibility of getting surgeries that are needed done, or going to see a doctor regularly, or being able to afford medication. So that's possible. But again, since this is a correlational study, it's not designed to prove that one's social status is in fact impacting health. We're just saying that we do see a positive correlation, right? As one goes up, the other goes up. So a positive correlation would mean the variables are going in the same direction. So as one goes up, the other goes up, or as one goes down, the other goes down. A negative correlation actually is letting you know that as one goes up, the other goes down. So they're actually going in different directions. So positive and negative, when we're looking at correlational studies, is not about whether or not it's good or bad, or you like it or not. It's about what are those variables doing? Are they going in the same direction, positive correlation, or are they going different directions, and that would be a negative correlation. Another possible correlation that might have come from studies is the connection between self-esteem and academic achievement. So as a person's self-esteem increases, so does their academic achievement. Again, could it be that X is making Y happen? Yes, but a correlational study is not there to be able to determine that. Because when we're looking at correlations, there's various possible explanations of why we're seeing what we're seeing. X might make Y happen, or maybe Y is making X happen, or maybe there's even a third variable, Z, that's making Y and X happen, or maybe there's even another variable, A, that's making Y happen and Z is making X happen. So again, correlational studies are not designed to determine cause and effect. They're just showing you relationships between variables. Now, I've already talked about experimental studies to some extent, or at least mentioned them in my lecture here. So what do experimental studies show us? Well, unlike correlational studies, experiments are in fact there to show us cause and effect. And that's the best design that we can use to try to get us close to showing and determining cause and effect. So how does the researcher do this? Well, there's a couple concepts that's important for you to be familiar with. And most of you have taken an intro to social, intro to psych class, so a lot of this is going to be repetitive. So what are the variables that researchers look at? Well, they look at independent variables. Now, the independent variable is basically the thing that the experimenter is controlling. So that means they've decided some people get it, some people don't. If I'm studying the effect of a drug on an individual's cocaine usage, then my independent variable would be the medication that they're taking, right? Because I want to see, is this medication helping to decrease cocaine use, for instance? So my independent variable in that scenario would in fact be the medication that I'm testing. And as I mentioned, I've decided some people get it, some people don't. That's what I mean by this is the thing that's being controlled. So when we're looking at an independent variable like this cocaine study, then I've decided some people get that drug that I'm testing and the others do not. They're typically the ones who get the placebo, or basically the thing that's nothing. It's just a filler. The independent variable, as I mentioned, is the thing being controlled by the experimenter, meaning they've decided some people get it, some people don't. But the other way to think about an independent variable is it's the focus of the study, and the researcher is interested in its impact. So that would be the independent variable. Now, your dependent variable is going to be the behavior that I look at that's going to determine or show me the effect of my independent variable. So the dependent variable is going to be the behavior that shows me the effect of the IV. So if we go back to this cocaine example, then again, is this drug helping to reduce cocaine use? Well, what's going to show me that? Well, what do I look at? I look at cocaine use. Has cocaine use increased or decreased? And so cocaine use is my actual dependent variable. What the dependent variable, again, is it's showing you the effect of the independent variable, and it's a dependent variable because it's relying on or dependent upon the impact or influence of the independent variable. Next are confounding variables. And confounding variables are those aspects that affect our results, but that the researcher did not think to include or consider. So confounding variables are aspects that affect the results that the researcher did not consider or include in the study. For example, going back to the cocaine study, what could be a confounding variable for cocaine usage or this study? Well, another way of thinking about it is, other than being able to have access to this pharmaceutical that might help cocaine use, what else can contribute to someone's cocaine use? Maybe stress. But one thing in working in chemical dependency in the past that I've seen is actual mental illness. So if a person's suffering from something like major depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, don't you think that might actually influence the level at which they might be using their drug of choice? In this experiment, that would be cocaine. So in this situation, or in this sample experiment, cocaine usage could be confounded by mental illness. So mental illness would be a confounding variable. Next is random assignment. So when we're looking at experiments, what we do is we actually decisively split people up into separate groups, a control group and an experimental group. And the main distinction between these two groups is the experimental group is the one that actually has people that receive the independent variable. So the people in the experimental group receive the independent variable, that condition or the thing being tested. The control group, however, is the group that does not receive the independent variable. They're going to receive everything else, but not the independent variable. So another way of thinking about the control group is if there's a placebo being used, that control group would be the one receiving the placebo. Why do we need both types of groups? Well, the control group really serves as a basis or a baseline for understanding the experimental group results. So say, for instance, I've decided today I'm going to start working out because it's been a long time since I've worked out regularly. So what I start doing is I decide I'm going to complete a mile today. And when I get home, my husband happens to be there. So I say to him, "Hey, Rob," that's my husband's name. "Hey, Rob, I just completed a mile. 1 hour? Beat that." Now, some of you are going, "Okay, Umali Kopp is being completely sarcastic," and I am. Because even if you're completely out of shape, you should be able to complete a mile just casually strolling within 20 to 30 minutes. So if I'm taking an hour, that's a bit ridiculous. Rob might think I'm walking down to the Starbucks having a Frappuccino and then coming back. So if he were to say to me, well, honey, you took an hour for a mile. Do you know what the fastest mile is now? Well, and then he says, well, the fastest mile is under 4 minutes. Well, all of a sudden, when I compare the under 4 minutes to my 1 hour, I realize my 1 hour really sucks. That's what the control group does for us. It helps us to determine whether or not the experimental group results are really meaningful and significant. So that if I say, hey, my experimental group decreased cocaine use by 75%, and you go, hey, that sounds fantastic, but what were your control group results? And I say, oh, they decreased cocaine use by 70%. What would that tell you about the drug that we're testing to see if it'll help with cocaine use? It would tell you that it's about as good as doing nothing, because the control group is in fact receiving nothing. It's receiving a placebo. So having that control group to shed light on the results for the experimental group is actually extremely critical to the experimental design, which abides by scientific method. Now, what I'd like for you to keep in mind is variables are never groups, and groups are never variables. Let me say that again. Variables are never groups, and groups are never variables. Additionally, placebo is never a variable, and placebo is never a group. So again, placebo is never a variable or a group. Make sure you keep that in mind, because on your exam, you will be given some study designs where you'll have to determine independent, dependent variables, confounding variables, and control and experimental groups. So this slide is showing you the design of an experimental study. So this study is wanting to determine, is exposure to violent TV going to have an effect on aggression? Or maybe I could say, does exposure to violent TV increase aggression? So what we do is we randomly assign individuals, ideally, to an experimental and control group, meaning there's an equal chance that anyone can be in either one of these groups. Also, when we initiate an individual's participation in a study, we do let them know that random assignment will be used to determine which group they get put into. So in the experimental study, that would be the group that watches violent TV. Because remember, we said we want to see if exposure to violent TV will increase aggression. So we're focused on violent TV and its impact. So violent TV would be the independent variable. Therefore, the experimental group will be receiving or being exposed to violent TV. So that means the control group is the one that does not receive the independent variable. Hence, you have the control group here that is exposed to non-violent TV. And the dependent variable is going to show us the effect or impact that the independent variable is having. So again, the study is looking at, does violent exposure to violent TV increase aggression? So in order for us to be able to determine this, what we do is look at aggression in the participants. So aggression here under measure would be your dependent variable. Validity, internal validity and external validity. These are really important concepts for us to be aware of when we're looking at experimental design as well. So internal validity is the extent to which we measure the true impact of the independent variable. So basically we say we're going to measure this, and we actually do. So the extent to which we measure what we say we are going to measure. External validity, the extent to which there can be a reasonable confidence that the same results would be obtained for other people in other situations. Meaning, external validity will show you the ability to generalize that information to a broader group so that it applies to people outside of the study group. Now, the thing to keep in mind, and that's what this diagram is showing you on the right, is that the closer we get to internal validity, the farther away we move from external. The closer we get to external validity, the farther away we get from internal validity. If I want to measure the experience of a certain phenomenon, say among women, and I create a design that is very effective at determining that, then my internal validity is going to be very strong. However, it might be limited to my ability to generalize that information to men? Or maybe I study African American women. Is it going to be generalizable to other women of other races and ethnicities? If I study older women, say 50 and above, is that going to be relevant or less relevant to younger women? So again, the closer we get to really measuring a phenomenon and determining a phenomenon within a specific group, the farther away we are or that we move from being able to generalize that information to other groups outside of the study. So the less likely that information will apply to people outside the study. A couple other really important concepts when we're looking at research methods is mundane realism and experimental realism. Mundane realism is really about having the study reflect an experience that mirrors a subject's real life experience, right? A person's a mother or a father, and then you put them in a situation where they have to think about themselves as a mother and a father. So that the focus or the design of the study is really relevant to their lives. It's something that they have gone through or they may go through realistically. However, experimental realism shows us that, it doesn't have to, a study doesn't have to have mundane realism. It doesn't have to reflect or mirror what an individual might really go through in life. What's important instead is experimental realism, meaning that the experiment, that situation feels real, that the individuals or participants are sucked in to the realism of that situation. So a study that we're going to be talking about is Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. And what they did is they took male college students and put them randomly into groups of guards and prisoners. And were they really in a prison? No. Have they ever been real prison guards? No. Have they ever really been imprisoned? No. But what happened was that study was so high in experimental realism that it made individuals feel like they were really in a prison, and so they acted accordingly in their prisoner or guard role. So that experimental realism had a significant impact in the Stanford Prison Experiment. So, experiments, ethical issues. This is the general design and process that researchers have to go through in order to be able to conduct an experiment. Once an individual has identified a subject matter that's important to them and they've done their literature review and gotten informed so that they can come up with a hypothesis, and how they get informed obviously is by obtaining information from other studies, by going through things like scholarly journals, doing searches on PsycInfo, ProQuest, EBSCOhost, and what have you, and looking at what other researchers have done in the past and what they've determined and discovered in their research studies. So an individual comes up with a question, they come up with a hypothesis, they've done the lit review, they've gotten educated on that subject matter, and then what they need to do is create a proposal and submit that proposal to an IRB, or an institutional review board. That institutional review board is a group of individuals that will actually approve a study based on its ethics, its design, its plan. The IRB board makes sure that the study won't have too much harm on individuals. If there's potential harm on subjects, that the researcher or researchers have a plan of action of how they're going to counteract that. So an IRB exists, for instance, in our school district for Santiago Canyon College, as well as Santa Ana College, our sister college. At UCLA, there would be various IRBs for the different colleges. Where my husband went to at Cal State San Bernardino for his master's, they actually had a specific IRB for math and sciences. So that IRB again makes sure that a study is well planned out, that design is safe and ethical, and that the procedure for that study will be done and conducted in an ethical manner. Once you get IRB approval, then you can actually start recruiting individuals based on the criteria that you've identified in your IRB form. Before an individual can actually start participating in your study, you must make sure that they sign and read through an informed consent. That informed consent actually notifies them as to the extent that their participation is expected, what the design of the study will be, what the design is focused on. Also, if you're going to be using, again, that experimental control group format. It'll let them know that there's a 50-50 shot of them getting in either one of those groups, that assignment is done randomly, and that they will not know during the time that they're in the study which group they're actually in. That informed consent also lets them know that they can leave the study at any time without penalty, and if they have earned any kind of incentives, they get to keep those regardless. They can even stay all the way to the very end of the study and then decide at that point, no, I don't want my data to be included, and we must honor that. Confidentiality. We also let the subjects know that their participation, their identity is completely confidential, that that's something that's kept under lock and key and that will not be released to the public. The role of deception. Every now and again, this is used in studies. The role of deception means that subjects are told that the study is based on one thing when it's actually based on something else. The one study that we'll actually look at some point is Ash's study. And what he did is the Confederates, or the people working for the study, in his research, told participants that their visual abilities were being tested. However, in fact, what they were looking at was conformity. So why didn't they tell them the study was about conformity? Well, think about it. If you're told that the study's on conformity, are you actually going to conform? No, you'll be conscious of not conforming. And so telling them the real reason for the study actually would prevent them from behaving as they naturally would. And so role of deception is allowed in that kind of a circumstance to preserve the subject's natural response. For instance, when I was a student at UCLA for my undergrad studies, I was actually a participant in a study where I had to work on a computer. And they had told me it was about, my ability to work on the computer. And truth be told, I wasn't really attentive when they were giving the instructions. And I did my thing, not knowing if I did it correctly because I wasn't listening in the beginning. And at the end of the study, when my participation was done, they would let me know, we want to let you know, we use the role of deception. The study was really about how well you pay attention to instructions. And I just sighed because apparently I'd failed miserably because I didn't listen to the instructions at all. But if they told me in the beginning that we want to see how well you follow instructions, then guess what? I would have been really attentive and really listened closely to those instructions. And so telling me the real truth to that would have actually prevented me from behaving naturally. Now, in order to remain ethical in studies, we are required to disclose role of deception. But I've only heard of one study that actually didn't require that. And the experiment went like this. What they did is they told an individual that they would be put in a group and they were studying ability to come up with some consensus, negotiate with other people. And so the actual participant would be put in a group with two other people. That participant thought the other two people were participants too, but in fact they were not. They were Confederates, meaning they worked for the experiment. Okay, but again, the real participant did not know this. So what they were told to do was come up with consensus, write down their answer or decision, and then the Confederates would always get the actual participant to bring that piece of paper to another room. And they were told, when you bring that paper to another room, you're going to get $10 for your time. And so sometimes when a participant would bring the paper, they would be given $10. And then sometimes they would turn in their paper and they would be like, here's $20, thank you for your time. So what do you think they were studying there? Well, what they were studying there was whether or not someone was going to lie about getting more money. That's the only study I've ever heard of where they were not required to tell the subject that role of deception was used, that they were really studying lying behavior versus ability to get along with others or negotiate with others. Why is that? Think about it. If I let a subject know that I know they've lied, is that going to make them feel better or worse? It's going to make them feel worse, and for that reason, role of deception disclosure was not required in that study because we want to make sure they leave feeling better rather than worse. Double-blind studies. This is where neither a participant nor the researcher knows which group a person is in. And this is done in order to decrease bias. It's much like random assignment, right? We use random assignment to decrease bias. That way individuals who are really motivated can't then self-assign to an experimental group or say I'm being given a bonus if I can prove that that pharmaceutical will help decrease cocaine use. So I can't inadvertently or intentionally put all the motivated or people I perceive to be motivated in the experimental group and all the lackadaisical people in the control group. So it prevents bias from happening in that way. Well, double-blind studies do that as well. It prevents bias. So again, if I'm in that study, I'm the researcher, and the pharmaceutical company has said, I'll give you $500,000 bonus if you can show that our drug has effectively reduced cocaine use. Well, that might be a real conscious motivator for me or even unconscious motivator for me. So what might happen is, consciously or not, I might start to treat people differently based on whether they're in the experimental group or control group. I might start to motivate the experimental group members more than I do the control group individuals. So having double-blind studies where I, as a researcher, also do not know what group they're in prevents bias from my perspective. And then debriefing happens at the very end. So what we want to do there is disclose any kind of role of deception where relevant, or might even inform individuals what group they were put in. It's an opportunity for us to check in with individuals and see how they're feeling at the end of their participation. And it's also an opportunity for researchers to provide subjects with additional contact information should they leave the study and then have questions later on. Biases in research. So can a researcher be completely unbiased? What do you think? Well, my perspective is no, they can't be completely unbiased. Why? Because we're humans, and humans by nature are subjective beings. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't strive to be unbiased. I mean, that's why we in social psychology or in psychology in general use a scientific method, because it's one of those ways that helps us to ensure that bias is reduced as much as possible. But to completely eliminate bias, as a cultural psychologist, my answer would be no. Because if you think about it, the questions I'm already presenting in my study are the questions that I think are important, and what has shaped that perspective is exposure that I've had to things or even my own life experience. So the goal is to try to reduce bias as much as possible in research, while knowing that that won't necessarily be completely possible, so that we have to be open to when bias might have affected our research in some way, discuss that, point that out, to forewarn other researchers to make sure to avoid doing that or repeating that in the future, or make sure that we also do not repeat that in the future. Also, experimenter expectancy effects. So experimenters, without even realizing, might convey their expectations to subjects without realizing it, and then they can ultimately affect the subject's response or behavior in the study. And this could happen unconsciously on both ends. I, as a researcher, might be doing things to kind of sway or influence an individual subject, and the subject might not even realize I'm influencing them, and then they respond accordingly. So a lot of this can happen on an unconscious level as well as intentional. And when we're looking at experimenter expectancy effects, even things like wording of a question can be leading and then conveying what I'm expecting the response to focus on. So we have to be really, really careful about conveying those expectations, intentionally or not, and be open to the fact that those might actually affect the results that we're looking at, and even how we interpret results. Because if we're trying to unconsciously or consciously look for a certain kind of result, then we will skew the data oftentimes, many times without realizing it, to kind of fit that expectation. Cultural bias, representative samples. That's another reason why we use random assignment when we're looking at experiments, because random assignment will help increase the chances that if it's important to us to have a diverse population, maybe a population in both experimental and the control group that really reflects the outside society, so is a microcosm of the outside community, that we randomly assign individuals to both groups so that we can make sure that there's, women in both sides, people of higher and lower socioeconomic status on both sides, people of different race or ethnic groups, again, if that's important to us on both sides, different sexual orientations, different life experience and stressors and pressures, so that we have representative samples in both groups in our experiment. The other thing too is having diverse samples on both sides, control and experimental group, help to make sure that any kind of confounding variables like life situation, family background, stressors, these kinds of things would actually counteract each other, because we're having individuals on both sides, control and experimental group. We have individuals on both sides that have those kinds of experiences. So again, having representative samples helps reduce cultural bias. Question order. So if we start to ask questions like, are you happy with your studies? Are you happy with your life? This might actually cause individuals who are responding to focus on happiness and not really think of other things. Whereas, how do you feel about your studies? How do you feel about your life? This kind of gives it a more open way for them to determine what kind of emotion to focus on. So if we order certain questions a certain way, it could influence what and how participants respond or what they think about as they're responding. Question wording. So, one simple example is using, oftentimes with what we do in society, male generic language. So, for certain, positions like a doctor, a lot of times they say he, right? And so, what we see in research is this actually has a strong effect even on children. So if you use male generic language, he, guy, that kind of thing, man, if we use that kind of male generic language to refer to both males and females, we see that kids will oftentimes still use a boy or a man as their reference point. That's who they're thinking of when male generic language is used. So we have to really be careful with the kind of language we're using. Also, we mentioned it previously when I was talking about the survey. How we word the questions, we got to make sure that it's as clear to as many people as possible. So when I did my dissertation, I had to run my questions by groups and groups of people to make sure it was really clear and that they were not leading. And even though I really tried hard to create questions that I thought were clean, when I first presented them to a group of people, they're like, Christine, these are totally leading. It's so obvious how you're expecting them to respond. So I didn't realize that my questions were leading subjects towards a certain kind of question, and I didn't even realize that my experimenter expectancy was influencing how I was wording those questions. So we have to be careful of that as well. And then the impact of language. So depending on the kinds of language that we use, this can actually influence what an individual is going to think of. It can influence something called priming. For instance, if I frame something a certain way, it will prime them to think of a certain thing or be in a certain mode of thinking. For instance, we find in research if we say, don't think about or don't think of, so I could say, don't think of pink elephants, don't think of tigers, don't think of your stressful test tomorrow. What ends up happening is you start thinking about that very thing that I told you not to. So we see the impact of language can happen in many different ways by, again, influencing our perspective, like the he, she thing, also influencing what we should or should not think about, priming individuals to think about certain things. And it can even influence how we're feeling or the kinds of emotions that we focus on. So what type of study is this? A study wanted to determine if drug use impacted academic performance in school. They recruited volunteers and split them up into two groups, drug users and non-drug users. So these would be individuals who are already using drugs or not using drugs. It would be unethical for us to get people addicted to drugs. They found that 60% of the students who used drugs earned one lower grade in at least one subject in school. Well, obviously there's some issues with this already, because if we say use drugs, well, different drugs have different effects. So we probably should have focused just on one drug or one category of drugs. Also, one lower grade in at least one subject. That can be a little fuzzy as well. But that's really with regard to operational definitions. We want to use operational definitions that are very concise and clean. When we say drugs, we mean meth. When we say grades, we mean the midterm and final grades in math in this, trig or what have you. So we want to be more specific. When we say happiness, we're going to measure happiness by looking at people's smiles, or when they express certain words that would show us happiness. So we want to give operational definitions that are very, very clear. So what kind of study is this? One great way to determine this is by asking, is something being controlled by the researcher? Meaning they've determined some people have it and some people don't. Some people get it, some people don't. Well, in this case, for A, the answer is yes. Some people are using drugs, others are not. So this would be an experimental design. We have your experimental group, those using drugs, and the non-drug users would be the control group. So what would be my independent variable? Well, again, the experimental group is drug users, so they're receiving the independent variable, so that would be drug use. I want to see if drug use impacted academic performance. So I want to see if drug use is affecting academic performance or causing a certain effect in academic performance. So that would be my independent variable. And then my dependent variable would be whatever I've operationally defined as academic performance. So maybe they're in progress and final grade in trigonometry. Researchers studied archival data in 100 cities in the U.S. and found that as divorce rates decreased within a community, the rates of teen pregnancy in that community decreased as well. So we see here that that information was obtained from archival data. So this would let you know that this is a correlational study. Again, we're not able to determine cause and effect with the data that has been collected. Now, what kind of correlational study is this? Is it positive, both going in the same direction, or negative variables going in different directions? Well, the two variables that I'm looking at are divorce rates and teen pregnancy. Divorce rates have decreased, so has teen pregnancy. They're going in the same direction, therefore it is a positive correlation. And last but not least, C, after receiving responses to surveys, a study concluded the more youth experience violence at home, the more they behave violently in school. So this is a survey data, and as mentioned previously, survey data shows you correlational data. So again, they're showing you two variables that are related in some way or associated in some way. So the two variables that we're looking at here is violence at home and then behaving violently in school. So as they experience more violence at home, that's going up. They also behave more violently in school. That's also going up. So this too would be a positive correlation because those two variables are going in the same direction.